on your personal computer through America Online. It includes photos and biographies of members of Congress, information about how the House and Senate work, and congressional schedules. America Online subscribers use the keyword C-SPAN. Once again, today's question is, who was the first president born outside the original 13 states? The answer, Abraham Lincoln, who was born in 1809 in Kentucky. Now, C-SPAN's Washington Journal continues.
Former Senator George McGovern, president of the Middle East Policy Council. What are you reading today?
Well, I was looking at a couple of stories here on the Middle East. One about Prime Minister Rabin's political difficulties as a supporter of the peace process with the Palestinians, and another on the move of 30 international donors to try to speed up assistance to the Palestinians, to provide jobs, to provide work projects, and to get some kind of economic stimulus moving there. I think Mr. Rabin does have serious political problems because the killing of some 20 Israelis recently by a terrorist raid has made it very difficult for him. But I think he also knows that notwithstanding the efforts of extremists to derail the peace process, we have to keep these negotiations moving.
What else?
On the Palestinian front, they're in serious difficulty. The unemployment rate is high. A great many people are wondering how the peace process has helped them. They don't see any improvement in their lives. So it's very important on that side of the equation to get some job-creating enterprises going so that people will realize that peace pays off, that accommodation with Israel pays off, and that it's worthwhile to live with a stable economy. I think another story that has caught my eye is one that says the House panel softens defense measure. Now, usually when that word soften is used on spending, it means that the Congress has agreed to spend more. But somehow, whenever we talk about defense, it's considered soft if you cut excessive military outlays. That story really caught my eye. I don't think it's soft to take a hard, critical look at the Pentagon's budget and look for ways where you can reduce spending operations. That's a tough measure when you tighten up on expenditures at the Defense Department. But curiously enough, if we cut back on funds for poor welfare mothers, we say, gee, that's a tough bill. You cut this bloated Pentagon budget, some $285 billion a year, and the critics say, gosh, you're going soft.
Bill Kristol, president of the Project for the Republican Future, veteran of the Bush and Reagan administrations. What are you reading today?
Well, I read Jim Glassman's excellent column in the Washington Post criticizing the Mexican bailout. Jim is not a conservative particularly, and he's, I think, a responsible internationalist who supported GATT and NAFTA. But he thinks, and I agree with him, that it's not at all clear that the president's policy here is the right policy. And I think what you're going to see increasingly after the initial rallying of bipartisan support for the president, having made his decision, is serious questioning of it, not on Buchanan or Perot type nationalist or nativist grounds, but just on the grounds that it's not smart policy to bail out investors who took a risk, knew they were taking a risk, and now are going to be held harmless for buying Mexican, dollar-denominated Mexican short-term notes.
One quote from that article, he says that a free market allows good economic ideas to drive out bad ones, but there has been some comparison to what we're doing with Mexico and what the Carter administration did with Chrysler in the late 1970s. Is it a fair comparison? Is it the same?
No, it's not the same. I think that was probably ill-advised, too. It happened to work out in that case. In the case of Mexico, you've now created one country that has U.S. Treasury backing for its bonds. Argentina doesn't, Brazil doesn't, Russia doesn't, Palestinian Authority doesn't, Israel doesn't. I think it's a very dangerous precedent. Are we going to now bail out every country that makes that has a foolish monetary policy, and that has to devalue, and that has to renegotiate its debt. It's not as if we haven't gone through this before, and my view is that Mexico should get together with its creditors and extend its debt. The creditors will have to take a hit. There may be some U.S. role here, but the President has not made a convincing case for it, and I think there's going to be increasingly a backlash. The President could not make his case to the American public or the Congress. He acted unilaterally. There's a certain impressiveness. I mean, I respect him for doing what he thought was right, but I'm not sure it was right, and I think an awful lot of Americans are going to be questioning that in coming weeks.
We'll come back to that issue. What else are you reading today?
What else am I reading today? It's the Wall Street Journal editorial, and Jack Kemp's bowing out of the Republican presidential sweepstakes, making the point that, you know, the party owes a lot to Kemp, and that we shouldn't abandon his message, especially his message of economic growth. I do think Jack Kemp, probably more than any other individual, helped transform the Republican Party in the late 70s and laid the groundwork for the Reagan victory and the Reagan Revolution. I'm sorry he's not running, but I do think it's important that the Republicans not simply be the party of cutting government, though I'm all for cutting government. We could have a slowdown or a recession later this year, early '96, and I think Americans are going to want to see what the Republican policies are that will stimulate the economy and provide for, you know, well-being for more of our citizens. And I do think there's a Kemp message out there that the different candidates can now try to appropriate for themselves.
George McGovern, a twofold question. In the editorial in the Wall Street Journal, the Journal writes, it may also be true that Mr. Kemp's heart wasn't in the race because his party's heart has moved away from Mr. Kemp's agenda. How does one determine whether or not he's going to run for the presidency? And you've done it from both sides, running in '72 and then considering a run later in your career and deciding not to do it. What factors do you take into account?
Well, I suppose there's no hard criteria for that. You could make the case that former Congressman Kemp backed away because the mood, the political mood of the country, is not quite as open and as innovative and as experimental as he would like. He came up with some very attractive ideas over the last 10 years, some of which were not particularly conservative. They were ideas that liberals could fasten onto. His idea, the empowerment of citizens, the enterprise zones in cities to stimulate the reconstruction of cities. Those could just as easily have been sold as liberal ideas. So it's possible that that's one of the reasons he backed away from a run now, that he sees a more conservative mood, especially in the Republican Party. I don't know that. I think highly of Jack Kemp, and he's one of the more attractive Republican possibilities. But in deciding when you run for president, you could draw the opposite conclusion, that the party needs that kind of leadership at a time when it may be drifting into too rigid a position. For example, I ran in 1972 not because I thought the prevailing view was to halt the war in Vietnam, but because that was not the prevailing view. Most people were supporting our policy in Vietnam. I thought the policy was wrong. I thought somebody had to raise the standard against the war, and so I made that a major issue, even at a time when polls indicated that a majority of Americans were supporting the policy then in effect.
I think Senator McGovern makes an extremely important point in leaving aside the merits of the Vietnam War as a matter of pure political analysis and strategy. It's a big mistake to make political decisions based on a snapshot of the status quo, because things change a lot in a year. And the notion that we know what message will work in a Republican primary a year from now, or the notion that you can't change the minds of voters, and that if a candidate's out making a case for the next year, that you couldn't push certain issues to the forefront that aren't now at the forefront, I think is a mistake. I don't know that that's why Jack Kemp isn't running, but I think to the degree that all of our political analysis tends to look at the status quo and project it in the future and assume that whatever people are talking about now is what they'll be talking about a year from now, it's a big mistake.
I want to get back to the newspapers, but I want to ask you about an old book that a lot of people read quite often called Fear and Loathing, The Campaign Trail 72, and it's by Hunter S. Thompson. You are interviewed in the last few chapters of the book, and you talk about the surprise of the landslide victory for President Nixon and your defeat in 1972. At what point during the campaign did you see that?
Well, Steve, I suppose the candidate is the last one to concede what would be an unfavorable trend. You have the responsibility day after day of trying to fire up your supporters and to get additional supporters. For whatever to myself that that election was gone until the day before the election. The morning of the election, my wife and I were going to cast our votes for the losing candidate, George McGovern. And as we left Sioux Falls that morning to head for Mitchell, I turned to Eleanor and said, you know, it's going to seem strange after today driving my own car. We won't have the Secret Service anymore. And she looked at me very sharply because that was the first time that either one of us had admitted to the other. We thought it was all over. I still can't quite believe I lost 49 out of 50 states, Steve. I talked to Walter Mondale a while back, who also lost 49 out of 50 states, and he says, after that happens, how long does it take before it quits hurting? I said, I'll let you know when I get there.
I spent the fall of 1972 as a student at Harvard, and since everyone I knew that was surrounded by there was for George McGovern for president, except for a certain number who were for Eldridge Cleaver, or whoever the candidate to your left was, I was kind of amazed that I was actually in agreement with 60% of the Americans, and somehow the surroundings of Cambridge, Massachusetts was not the rest of America. That was a useful lesson for me, I guess.
When did you see the defeat for the Bush-Quayle ticket in 1992?
Well, I was pessimistic quite early, and I don't say this to try to take credit for any kind of prescience. I was worried after the Gulf War, even though President Bush's approval ratings were very high. When he went to Congress and made that speech, I think it was April 6th of '91, after the great victory in the Gulf, and said, now we should turn to our domestic agenda, and our domestic agenda is passing. I just thought the mood of the country was for activism. I think we could have sold, frankly, a policy of conservative activism, a conservative reform agenda, very much like what Newt Gingrich and the House Republicans ran on this year. The Bush administration never went that route, ended up being portrayed as defending the status quo in a circumstance where most Americans thought the country was on the wrong track. So I was pretty steadily pessimistic, and nothing happened in the '92 campaign to change my mind. I guess I really knew it was over at the debate. I guess it was the second. There was the first presidential debate where the president did all right, then the vice presidential debate where Dan Quayle did quite well, I think, and gave the ticket a little bounce and energized our supporters, and I thought set things up pretty well for the president for the second debate. Remember, Al Gore wouldn't really defend Bill Clinton too much on either the issues of taxes or trust. And then when the second debate, which was the forum, type debate, I think in Richmond, and George Bush looked at his watch twice and didn't have a very good answer to the young person who asked what he was going to do to help her, I think it was, or him, with problems. I mean, that's when I knew it was over.
Bill Kristol and George McGovern will be with us for another hour. Our phone lines are open. We'll show you the number at the bottom of your screen. We welcome your calls and your faxes. From the Associated Press, George McGovern, the dateline is Jerusalem. Israeli officials say tomorrow there will be what's being called an unprecedented Arab-Israeli summit to try to break the stalemate on the Mideast peace process. Among those who will be at the meeting will be leaders from Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the PLO. Your reaction?
Well, that's a very important meeting. I think from the standpoint of all the parties, the Arab states, the Palestinians, the Israelis, this peace process is frustrating and uncertain, and as difficult as it is, it's still better than just chronic, continuous conflict among the various parties in the Middle East. They can't afford it politically, economically, morally. Neither can the rest of the world that has an interest in the Middle East. So any effort to get the peace process back on track, I think, deserves the highest priority.
Are you following this story at all?
Sure. I was actually in Israel about 3 weeks ago for a week, and also visited Jericho, where the Palestinian Authority is now ruling, or trying to rule.
What did you learn over there?
Well, the political support for the peace process is evaporating, I think, because it just hasn't worked well so far, and there's great uncertainty about where it goes from here. I mean, I don't think the Israeli people are willing to give over more of the occupied territories if they perceive those as becoming a base for increased terror, if they perceive those as being a stable area of Palestinian self-rule. I think there would be considerable support among the Israeli people for reasonable accommodation in terms of dividing up the occupied territories. So it's an awfully tense time in Israel, and I wouldn't say a particularly optimistic or cheerful time. On the other hand, in certain respects, you have amazing success stories there. You have Israel, the Israeli economy doing very well. Israel having absorbed a huge wave of immigration. Remember, it was supposed to be such a disaster for Israel. These Soviet Jews weren't used to working. They lived in a socialist economy, but in fact they've been absorbed much more easily than most people think. There are problems, but the economy is doing well, and I think that's really a success story. You have peace with Jordan, you have the peace with Egypt holding, and for all the talk, I mean, the terror is very bad, but in fact the strategic situation is reasonably quiet with vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis Jordan, vis-a-vis Egypt. The great fear in Israel is Iran and Iraq, and nuclear, chemical, biological warfare. And I think the one thing they impressed upon me, and this was across the political spectrum, was that the U.S. isn't being serious enough about the whole nuclear proliferation or chemical and biological warfare proliferation, especially with regard to Iran and Iraq.
Prime Minister Rabin, by the way, has confirmed that he will be in Cairo. Again, these talks getting underway tomorrow as a way to try to break the stalemate in the Mideast peace process. In the New York Times, the headline says past UN chiefs will not be invited to the 50th anniversary events, in part because of Kurt Waldheim and his military past involved in the Nazi government directly or indirectly. Do you know about this?
Well, I know a little about it, Steve. It's really a tragedy, the Waldheim case, when he was revealed to have been cooperative with some of the more tragic Nazi crimes in World War II. I found that very disappointing. I had served as a delegate to the United Nations, a Senate delegate, along with former Senator Baker during the time when Mr. Waldheim was Secretary General. He seemed to me to be a constructive and decent and effective man in that post, but obviously he'd covered up a black chapter in his past, and it's plagued him and also, I think, hurt the United Nations ever since.
On to another issue. In the style section of the Washington Post, T.R. Reid has a piece called Rift in Coverage, Japanese and Western Quake Reporting Worlds Apart. Bill Kristol, let me just read you part of it. Western reporters tended to accentuate the negative, focusing on the worst scenes of the destruction and the most crushing moments of personal loss, while the Japanese media seemed more inclined to keep a distance. What does that tell you about Western culture versus Japanese media?
Well, I guess it tells us that Western media, you know, they cover a lot of what the press does is cover tragedies and terrible stories, and there's a certain amount of reveling in the ghastliness of it all, but also I think a certain amount of interest in stories of heroism and, you know, human interest, people surviving and helping each other. I guess I wasn't so, I mean, I think it was a terrible tragedy, over thousands of people were killed. I do think perhaps in Japan it's such a relentlessly, they always want to be sort of upbeat, and they don't want to demoralize their own citizenry, so there may have been a bit of an implicit understanding in the Japanese media, which is less free in some respects. It's formally free, but I think the spirit isn't quite the same as in the Western media. There may have been more of a sense of we need to urge people to pull together and can't get them depressed by telling depressing stories of, you know, whole, you know, the kind of destruction that happened.
And don't you think we could have had a situation in reverse, though, if the U.S. media hadn't given dramatic attention to the suffering and destruction there? They might have been accused of ignoring problems in somebody else's backyard while concentrating on the difficulties we have here at home. I found that story rather peculiar. I think that this is a tragedy that should have been spotlighted by the Western media.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to.
No, I'm not being critical
of the Western media. I think it does tell you more about Japan, let me put it that way, perhaps than about our media and the extent to which it is still a society, for all that it's had 50 years of democracy and does have a free press and a vigorous political debate. There's still a certain sense, for better and for worse, of a kind of social solidarity that even permeates the media, whereas in the U.S. that's pretty much gone, again, for better or worse. And you have a pretty, you know, the media doesn't feel much obligation to pretty over events for the sake of cheering up the citizenry or inspiring them to do good deeds.
T.R. Reid is the Tokyo bureau chief for the Washington Post, and it's in the style section. Front page of the Post has Americans go to bat for owners. Have you read this story?
I was surprised. I guess my reaction is a plague on both your houses. I think the strike has to end. I frankly don't know who are the principal culprits, whether the major blame lies with the players or with the owners. But this is a sport the American people love. I'm surprised, first of all, that most Americans blame the players more than they do the owners, although perhaps that's a legitimate point of view. I don't feel strongly about attaching blame one way or the other. But what surprises me even more about that story is the strong opposition of the American public to the president doing anything about this. I had just told somebody as recently as yesterday who asked my opinion on a few of the things the president might do to strengthen his hand that settling the baseball strike might be one of them. Apparently I was wrong about that. If this poll is right, they say to the president, keep hands off.
Well, I think that may just reflect their deep distrust of government doing anything right. I think, in fact, if Bill Clinton intervened and solved the strike, there would be a certain amount of gratitude. And I agree. I am a small government man and think government should stay out of most things. But this is a case where I do think government should butt in and you know, knock the owners and players' heads together, and if need be, even think about imposing or at least creating conditions which would provide strong incentives for settlement, because this is an issue. I mean, baseball is the national pastime, and it's just because you have either selfish players or selfish owners, it's not clear to me why my kids and tens of millions of other kids should be deprived of the pleasure of watching baseball.
As a former resident of Massachusetts, a Red Sox fan?
Well, I grew up in New York, and I was a Mets fan there, but then when I went to Harvard for all those years, I became a Red Sox fan.
Is there a farm team in South Dakota?
No, but I've been a St. Louis Cardinal fan since I was 10 years old. My dad used to be a part of that organization. He was in their farm system at Des Moines years ago. But I've always thought the Cardinals were very special. Bill and I do agree on baseball, though we may disagree on some things, but I thought his last answer was right on target.
We're going to
knock their heads together and settle this strike.
We're going to get to calls in just a moment, but let me ask each of you, what papers do you read on any given day, and is there a columnist that you particularly look for on any given day? Bill Kristol, start with you.
Well, I guess like everyone in Washington, I read more papers than I need to, so I can read the same news over and over and over. They always thinking, though always frustrated in this hope that, you know, I'll learn something different from reading yet another story about the same event. But no, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Times and the Washington Post, I guess basically. Columnists, yeah, I'm George Will, Charles Krauthammer in the Washington Post, the Journal editorial page, generally, I would say.
Well, I read those same papers. I suppose I lean a little more towards the Washington Post than the others. I've lived in this town so long. I think as far as columnists are concerned, one of my favorites is Hobart Rowan of the Washington Post. He's one of the few people that can make economics understandable for me. And then I like Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, especially on legal and judicial questions. There are others, but those are two that stand out.
You also contribute from time to time to the Washington Times. Do they come to you? Do you go to them? How does it work?
Well, we send out these memos from time to time, giving Republican leaders unsolicited advice on what they should and shouldn't be doing. And I guess quite often the Washington Times editorial page thinks they're interesting enough to share with their readers, so it's really their decision to print those memos.
One of the headlines from the Washington Times, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich pledges House will achieve a balanced budget by the year 2002. He says regardless of what happens on the Senate side, which will begin debate today on that issue, the House will do it. North Andover, Massachusetts, our first call. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a comment to William Kristol. He often refers to the Reagan Revolution, and I'm a little bit frightened to think that if we are going through another revolution, does that mean we're going to triple the deficit, reduce union membership, and reduce our paychecks? And the other comment I would like to make is to Senator George McGovern, that we are still very proud of you from Massachusetts, and we, you know, will go down in history as making the right decision in 1972. And again, thank you very much. You're a man of decency, and I think the Senate and the House could use more people like you in there today. You know, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Do you remember what percentage of the vote you received in Massachusetts?
Well, I think it was somewhere around 60%, as I recall. I've been under the strong impression the last 22 years, Dave, that the most perceptive voters in the country live in Massachusetts in the District of Columbia. Those are the two that I carry.
Bill Kristol.
Although I think South Dakota voters are especially precious, too. They kept me in office for almost a quarter of a century.
My wife told me before coming over here this morning that she voted for George McGovern in '72, and though now she's, I think, politically on the other side, she doesn't regret the votes. And she thinks she voted for the better man in the election, if not maybe for the better policies. In terms of the caller, he obviously disagrees with Ronald Reagan's policy goals, and I more or less agree with him. And I do think the real story of the 1994 election is that the Republican Party re-energized itself with a renewed Reaganite vision, and the voters gave it a mandate. Now, obviously, we'll see how Republicans do over the next 2 years, and we may fall short and we may lose that mandate. But I do think we have a chance to carry on the path that Reagan started us down in the 80s, which I think is basically a good path for the country.
Doug Abrams, also in the Washington Times, has a story about Republicans looking to cut cable rates for subscribers. Are we going to be seeing a lot of this with the cable industry, with telecommunications, and with other contract with America proposals in the next, 85 days left in the 100-day commitment?
I think some of it may take a little longer than 100 days. You know, it's interesting that you just read a couple of stories from the Washington Times. Senator McGovern said he's a longtime Washingtonian and a fan of the Post. I do think one of the stories of the last few months and few years is the emergence of the Washington Times as a real alternative paper in Washington, which, you know, breaks real news with a very good editorial page now under Todd Lindbergh, and it's just interesting that I don't think on this show 5 or 10 years ago, you know, one would have been citing the Washington Times as a sort of equally reputable news source, but they've actually, of course, they have better access in some ways to Republican news sources, but their coverage of the contract with America and of the Congress, I think, in the last month has been particularly striking. I do think covering Congress, I'm not a journalist, but is very hard for the press. It's not like the executive branch where there's one president and he has a statement every day and you sort of know what the main news story is. And you've got a million committees meeting and legislation moving at different paces through different houses of Congress, and a lot of it's happening behind the scenes. And I do think it's an interesting challenge for the print press and for TV to try to explain, especially when so much of the agenda is being driven from Congress, which of course historically is not the case in American politics, to try to give people a feel for what's going on. And I've just noticed reading the papers that each of them are trying to grapple with this in somewhat different ways.
Let me just say, having said some kind words about the Post, I'm grateful that we have the Washington Times. South Dakota does, Washington does need an alternative newspaper. We need 2 good, strong papers in this city. There are stories from time to time that appear in the Washington Times you don't find in the Post. There are editorial slants and columnists that appear in the Times that I find well worth reading. I thought it was a great loss to the city when the Washington Star folded some years ago, and the Washington Times, in its own way, helps to fill that void. So we're very fortunate to have it.
Ocala, Florida, you're next on this Wednesday as you continue with C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Good morning.
I would be interested in hearing these 2 gentlemen comment on the declining income of the lower 80% of America. It seems to me that I've read where the take-home purchasing power of the lower 80% of America has declined 20% since 1980, and the upper 20% has gained 60%. As I read about the salaries of people like Mr. Eisner and ball players and what have you, I don't see where they really need to increase their incomes anymore. Also, I think we probably buy far too many things abroad that could be manufactured here.
Thanks very much.
Well, I myself did a column recently for the Washington Post for the Outlook section in which I discussed this very point. The gentleman is absolutely right. If you compare the real income, the purchasing power of the income of American families, the gentleman is absolutely right. For 80% of Americans, that real income is less today than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. There's been a decline that I think explains much of the frustration and anger in the country. And I've warned the Clinton administration people that when they talk about the great growth of our economy, and there has been some growth, they need to understand that most Americans in their own lives haven't experienced that. The growth in the economy is largely at the top. That was true under previous Republican administrations. It's true under the present administration. And in my opinion, that's the central economic problem we have to address in this country, the declining well-being of most of the middle class and most of the working people in this country.
Seattle, Washington. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'd like to address a question to Mr. Kristol. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the extremely important part you played in the revolution this November. I don't know how many people outside the Beltway know how important you were to that. But I wanted to, in the same vein that I'm very grateful for that, I was wondering if perhaps you might be able to exert some of your influence in the matter of this Mexican bailout. An earlier caller tonight mentioned something about the fact that Mr. Rubin, who is now at Treasury, who was also apparently formerly head of Goldman Sachs, someone mentioned the fact that someone had investigated and checked that Goldman Sachs was holding approximately $7 billion worth of Mexican paper. I don't know if it's true, but if it is true, I was wondering if you might be able to exert your influence, find out if this is indeed the case, and perhaps demand that Congress ask Mr. Rubin to recuse himself from this scenario and perhaps even reverse the decision. This is not what the Revolution of November was about. If we're going to be asking welfare mothers to buckle up and take responsibility, which I think they should, we can't be sitting around with our underwear flapping and asking for the big boys to get bailed up as well.
Thanks very much. Bill Kristol.
Well, thanks for your kind words, first of all. I don't know if Secretary Rubin's underwear is flapping or not, and I'm sure he has honorable motives. I wouldn't question those necessarily, but I do agree with this. We should have serious hearings and a serious debate over what the President ordered yesterday. It's a major commitment of U.S. resources. It's a major foreign economic policy decision. He's found a way to do it without getting congressional consent, which he had said for 3 weeks he needed and failed to get. But there's no reason for Republicans now to roll over and say, well, gee, it's a done deal, and most of the editorial pages seem to like it, and some of Wall Street seems to like it, so it shouldn't be questioned. And I think there are serious economic questions to be raised about whether this is sound policy, and they've been raised by economists really across the spectrum. Not simply by, as I say, those inclined towards to be critical of the Clinton administration all the time. I also think it's important that responsible Republicans, someone like Senator Graham, Jack Kemp, raise questions, so it doesn't appear to be either you're a responsible internationalist on the one hand, or you're a Buchanan, Perot type nativist on the other. I think there are serious objections to this policy, and I hope we have real congressional hearings on it.
From the federal page of the Washington Post is an article by Stephen Barr on a new book, which is called Thickening Government, Federal Hierarchy and the Diffusion of Accountability. And it begins by saying that in 1960, when you first became active in government here in Washington, George McGovern, there were 17 layers of management at the top of the federal government. By 1992, there were 32.
Before I comment on that, Steve, could I just take a minute on the previous question? We used to have a senator by the name of Stuart Symington, who was here for many years in Washington. He once said that there are only two people who understand the international monetary situation: the head of the Rothschild Bank and an obscure Swiss bank clerk, and that they disagree with each other. That's about the way I am on these international monetary problems. I've always found them enormously complex, but I just want to say two quick things about President Clinton's action. Number one, he did take the precaution of getting support for the action that he took yesterday by getting Senator Dole, the Republican leader of the Senate, and Speaker of the House Gingrich to join with him in saying that this was a needed and necessary measure. The second thing is that it's clear that we did this not out of some kind of generosity towards Mexico, but because we thought it was essential to the American economy. Whether that proves right, only time will tell. Now, on the matter of the growth of federal bureaucracy, the interesting thing about this new book that's reported in today's press is that it concentrates on the bureaucracy at the top. It concentrates, Bill, on the 22,000 presidential appointees that have increased many-fold since the 1930s. The Clinton administration, in their talk about reinventing government, have been looking at bureaucracy below that level. And what this gentleman is saying is that we build in too many layers between the president and the cabinet officers and the top executives in the government. And I agree with that. I think it makes the White House sluggish. It makes it less responsive. it actually hampers the president rather than helping him to have so many layers of top bureaucracy between him and his cabinet officers, and I applaud the book.
Let's get a call from Pensacola, Florida.
Morning. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Go ahead.
My first comment is that it seems since your new format has been in effect that you're not taking as many viewers' calls as you had in the past.
Actually, I think we're taking more because we have a longer format and we're taking more open phones as well.
Well, I disagree.
We take between 30 to 40 each morning.
Well, anyway, it's a real pleasure to talk to you.
And you got through, right?
I got through.
So we're glad to hear from you.
Amazing. I have a comment from Mr. McGovern when he made used the term a few minutes ago of the bloated military. What he fails to mention, and he's been talking about this for the last 30 years, about how the military has to be downsized and practically done away with, is that he never mentions in the last 30 and a half years that we've thrown away $5 trillion of taxpayers' money on these liberal socialist welfare programs. And the other thing is, if we had followed Mr. McGovern's policies that he's been expounding now for the last 35 years, today there probably wouldn't be C-SPAN, and if there was, you would all be speaking Russian. Thank you.
Bill Kristol will get you first on that.
I guess that wasn't a McGovern voter for 72. Well, on the Defense Department, there has been real cuts in defense spending over the last decade, beginning with the Reagan administration, actually, of about 27-28%, I think, in real dollars. The number's almost exactly what it was 10 years ago, and of course inflation has eaten up about 30% of that budget. If we could do the same on domestic programs, we would have a balanced budget, not in 7 years even, but I think in 3 or 4 years. So I do think, we have made real cuts in defense. Maybe some of them have gone too far, some of them may have been done unwisely. But the notion that we still have this huge bloated Cold War defense, I'm not sure it was ever bloated, but even if it was at one point very large because of the demands of the Cold War, it's been cut an awful lot more than any other government program has been cut.
I want you to respond to the caller, but let me also read you this fax from a viewer in Lake City, South Carolina. Did you meet with then-student Bill Clinton in Russia during the Vietnam War? And if so, do you recall the discussion you had, and will you share it with us? So on that fax and on the call.
You can make news here, Senator. Let's reveal the truth.
Well, curiously enough, I met Bill Clinton the first time right here in Washington. He wanted to work for me in the 72 campaign. We sent him to Texas to be our Texas coordinator, where he did an excellent job. There was a young woman by the name of Hillary Rodham, also assigned to Texas, and shortly after that campaign, they were married. But I hadn't been to Russia, just for the record here, and I'm embarrassed about this. I guess I'm the only candidate, the only nominee for president of either party who had not been to Russia at the time they were nominated and ran for the presidency. I didn't get there until 1977. Let me just say about the gentleman from Pensacola, I appreciate his concern. Obviously, we have to have a strong defense. This is still a dangerous world. It has been all of my life. And I've always been for a strong national defense. I was a bomber pilot in World War II. The first thing I learned in that war when I signed up for the Air Force, we didn't have any instructors, we didn't have any training planes, we didn't have any airfields. So we have to have an adequate national defense. What I'm calling for are modest reductions in defense outlays at a time when the Cold War is over. Now, the gentleman is quite correct. I've been pushing for modest reductions in defense outlays for 35 years. The reason for that is that as a young member of the Congress, I was tremendously impressed by the late President Eisenhower's farewell address. I think it was the greatest farewell address since George Washington's. And in that address, he said the #1 problem before this country was the mounting power of the military-industrial complex, that we have to come to terms with it and bring it under control. I've been fighting for that, I regret to say, sometimes almost alone ever since, and I really believe that those cuts should be made on a larger basis than they have been so far.
Baltimore, Maryland, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Just wanted to make a comment regarding the Mexican peso bailout. You know, the president has his cronies running around like Mr. Reich complaining about corporate welfare, and yet he's too quickly willing to send $20 billion to Mexico for a government welfare program to bail out the Mexican government. So I guess it's okay if our resources go to inefficient sectors such as the Mexican government that can't seem to work out their own problems with their markets. But when it comes to capital-producing sectors in this country, he doesn't want to provide any quote-unquote corporate welfare programs. Thank you.
Thanks for the call. Let's move on to another caller from California, Modesto. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I've got a question for Senator McGovern and a quick question for Bill Kristol if there's time.
Certainly.
Senator McGovern, I live out here in the Central Valley of California, and we're beginning to hear reports about the World Disarmament Conference in San Francisco as part of the UN anniversary. And I was wondering if you agree with the World Disarmament people that the ownership of private firearms should be limited, if not eliminated. And the irony of all this is that it's going to start on April 19th, the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which was started when the British came to confiscate the arms and shot and powder of the Lexington and Concord militia.
Stay on the line. We'll get your follow-up.
Yeah, I think those are two different issues. In my judgment, the Disarmament Conference ought to concentrate on international arms traffic and not on the control of domestic arms manufacturers. That's a different issue. It has to do with gun control and gun regulations here in our own society. And I don't think it ought to be intermingled with international conferences on arms control and on non-proliferation of weapons and that kind of issue.
And Bill Kristol is standing by for your next question.
Yes, sir. Bill, I'm out here in a fairly conservative part of Central California, and there's been no problem with Jack Kemp dropping out. In fact, it was a headline story of the Modesto Bee yesterday. The problem seems to be that Bill Kristol and Bill Bennett would not be able to win a California primary because of their opposition to Prop 187. And believe it or not, on 120 radio stations, Robert K. Dornan, B1 Bob, threw his hat in the ring, even though his office is denying it now, as a possible presidential candidate in '96. And I think it was a trial balloon, hoping he'd get the kind of support Ross Perot got in '92 when he went on the Larry King Show. Do you have any comments, please?
Well, on Jack Kemp, I don't know that whether he would have carried California or not. I do think he's played a service to the party, and I do think parts of the message, and I think generally being sympathetic to immigration. And I was with Jack on his opposition to Prop 187. Obviously, most of the voters of California didn't agree with us, and maybe they were right and we were wrong. But I think generally speaking, the pro-growth message is an important message, the message of economic opportunity, and I do think other candidates will pick it up. So we'll see. I do think, just to get the previous caller on the Mexican bailout, I think there's a brewing populist rebellion here on this, and I really do hope, as I say, that it doesn't spin into a sort of nasty, we don't care about Mexico direction. I think there's a real substantive debate, as Jim Glassman in the Post points out, about whether this is the right thing for Mexico, and I hope we have a serious debate about this and serious congressional hearings.
San Antonio.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Senator McGovern. I just want you to know that I think you are the most decent human being in this country, and you make me proud to be an American. I've got tears rolling down my cheeks, excuse me. But you are the antithesis of the meanness and ugliness that exists in America, and do you not think that with Newt Gingrich and his ilk, and with the savage Christian right that they use God as their excuse, we are headed inevitably and inexorably back into the 60s, where we are going to have race pitted against race, all in the streets killing each other, and the police and the army being used against the people again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's such a warm endorsement. It's almost embarrassing to me, but obviously I appreciate it. I know this woman speaks from the heart. Whether or not I deserve those plaudits is debatable. I am concerned about the mean-spiritedness that has come into American politics. It's not entirely on one side. It's become a kind of a bipartisan disappointment of our politics. There is too much harshness. There is too much backbiting, too much narrow partisanship at a time when I think the country requires a more tolerant and broad-based approach to our problems. I went to a memorial service yesterday for the late John White, the former Democratic chairman, a marvelous man from Texas, and he was quoted after his death in saying that he loves Washington, but he deplores the mean spirit that has come to this city in recent years. I share that concern.
In USA Today this morning, Bill Kristol, is an article about radio talk shows, and it says political power may have changed hands in Congress, but in the world of talk radio, there is still plenty to gripe about.
Well, I mean, I think Senator McGovern is a decent human being. There are a lot of decent human beings on the other side of the aisle and in the Christian right, and I do think it's important not to stigmatize the people with whom we disagree as being evil or savage, as the viewer said, even when we strongly disagree with their positions. Talk radio is an interesting phenomenon. I think it gets a bit of a bum rap. There's a lot of sort of high spirits on talk radio and occasional mean-spiritedness. There's also a lot of good humor on talk radio and genuine, I think, participation that I think is healthy. If it didn't exist, there'd be a lot of pent-up resentment out there that wouldn't get expressed. I think the same is true of talk TV. So I think those who sit around Washington clucking about talk radio offer to people who would prefer to be able to do things in Washington without being under the kind of instant spotlight that talk radio puts us under. It has its deficiencies in terms of policymaking. It can lead to some ill-considered judgments sweeping the nation, but it also has its virtues, and I guess I'm confident enough in American democracy that I think it will survive perfectly well the advent of a new form of communication like talk radio or cable call-in shows or the fax machine or internet or anything or any other technological advance.
We'll go back to the old-fashioned telephone. Federal Way, Washington. Good morning.
Hello. I'm kind of nervous. First of all, I'd like to say, Mr. McGovern, I used to live in Wagner, South Dakota. I grew up in the area, and I did vote for you, and I think you were the best for the vote.
Thank you.
You might want to explain where Wagner is situated in the state.
Well, it's not more than about 25 miles from Avon, where I was born. It's in the south-central part of the state, a lovely community.
Continue, caller, please.
My thoughts and maybe one question is on the peace process. I often look at the peace process and I think, how are these laws going to apply? Well, Israelis' laws live under one law. Palestinians live under military law. What if we turned it around? Do you see terrorists on both sides, but you don't see the legalization of blowing up and sealing settlers' houses if they're involved in terrorism, or extremist Jewish sects being rounded up by the thousands?
Well, the caller makes a good point. Nobody can condone these recent killings, the slaughter of these 20 young Israeli soldiers that took place recently. But it is a fact that if you look at this standoff between the Palestinians and the Israelis over the last 40 years, many times the number of Palestinians have been killed in violent actions as compared to Israelis. Now, that doesn't condone terrorism on either side. It simply points up that this has been a bloody relationship on both sides. One person's terrorism is another person's fight for freedom. I suppose the British thought George Washington and his guerrilla army were terrorists. But that's the importance of the peace process, not so much to point the finger at who's been the guiltiest, but to recognize that it's in the interest of both sides, and clearly in the interest of the United States, to keep these negotiations going. I think it's very difficult. I think, as Bill Kristol points out, the mood in Israel right now is understandably very jaundiced towards the peace process. They thought once they recognized the PLO and got these discussions started, that the violence would subside. It hasn't worked that way. I just hope that somehow the hardliners and the extremists on both sides will not be permitted to prevail either way.
Let me go back to the papers quickly. Two things from The Hill, which is a newspaper on the dealings of Congress. Charles Lewis has a column, The Influence Game, and he says that of the members who left Congress between 1984 and 1993, 81 of the 99 who stayed in Washington became lobbyists, according to a new book. Surprise you?
Doesn't surprise me. I don't think it's a particularly happy statistic that you've just quoted. We probably have too many high-powered lobbyists in Washington. We need lobbyists. They perform a certain useful function, but I think it's overdone.
And in the Washington Times, an editorial about Ron Brown, Bill Kristol begins by saying, anytime a powerful politician invests zero funds in an unsuccessful corporation venture and walks away with a capital gain of more than $400,000, eyebrows are raised and questions arise.
I mean, I haven't actually had the energy to follow the Ron Brown story through all of its details and winding roads. It looks pretty serious, and it looks like there are, real questions have been raised about his candor in reporting on these dealings, and I suppose on the dealings themselves. Just on the Middle East, not to get in a big debate on that, but I really just would point out that many more Palestinian Arabs have been killed by Arab governments in the last 40 years than by the Israeli government. I hope the peace process works, but I do think the situation is not one where one can even-handedly criticize extremism on both sides. I think the terror comes predominantly from one side and against a democracy which is trying to make some difficult decisions and sacrificing real strategic advantages for the sake of peace.
Reston, Virginia, you're next. I think we'll show you a picture from Washington. The sun is out. Mild temperatures, no more snow. It has been an unbelievable winter here in the nation's capital. About 50 degrees, we're told, today. The snowstorm of the season, I think we had, 3 or 4 inches of snow. The city panicked on Saturday evening.
Right, not like South Dakota. Right.
Or Massachusetts.
Right.
Go ahead, Reston, please.
Good morning. We had about 6 inches out here, Steve.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It was all right. It was fun. Good morning. Senator, first off, a comment. I think Barry Goldwater knows what it's like to be steamrolled. Your old colleague, Lyndon Johnson, left his footprints all over him quite well back in '64. As a matter of fact, speaking of Senator Goldwater, I think some of his comments that have been in the news the last couple of months have been quite interesting concerning his neoconservative friends, but that's another topic. My question is, Republicans, it seems to me, are trying to call into question again some of Secretary Brown's past business dealings. Now, given the fact that Secretary Brown is acknowledged to be one of the most, if not the most, successful Commerce Secretary in recent history, and given the fact that Secretary Brown has proven to be a man who's more than capable of a political adversary, having guided the Democrats to the presidency in '92, and also given the fact that the Secretary may be tapped to head up the President's '96 re-election campaign, do you think that this Republican re-examination of his business dealings is really an attempt to smear his character out of fear of his political skills so he won't be able to manage the President's re-election?
Who'd like to take that one?
I'll comment on the Goldwater part just for a moment. When I lost so heavily in '72, the very first senator who called me was Senator Goldwater. He sent over a cartoon showing he and I as the American Gothic figures. And then he said, "Dear George, if you must lose, lose big." In any event, he and I have been personal friends for many, many years. I think with regard to Ron Brown, I've always known him to be a man of integrity, an extremely capable man. I don't know what the merits of this case are. If there's some kind of wrongdoing here, it ought to be brought out, even if it is embarrassing on the eve of another presidential election. My own view is that there's probably not much here, but let's see.
Just 2 points on Ron Brown. It's really not been the Republicans. It's been the press, including the Washington Post, who've been leading the investigation. So it really is not a partisan issue, I think, and we'll see what happens. I want to prejudge it either. I mean, the caller mentions Barry Goldwater's campaign and yours. I do think one can say this. It's a striking feature of American history that often the presidential nominees who have lost the most overwhelming races have ended up shaping the character of their party in the future more than nominees who ran closer races or who won. And Barry Goldwater had a profound effect, obviously, on the Republican Party. Some people would say for ill, I would say for good, with Ronald Reagan, his heir, the man who came to prominence, making a speech for Barry Goldwater in the last week of the '64 campaign, inheriting the mantle and, of course, winning in 1980. And now I think the 1994 Republican victory is, in a sense, the third generation, if you will, of a sort of Goldwater critique of big government liberalism. And George McGovern had a profound influence on the Democratic Party, and Bill Clinton, who came into politics to work for him, is now the president. So it is interesting in American politics that often people who, at the time, lose big end up shaping the future more than more cautious candidates who run, in some conventional sense, better races.
Two names from the book that I want to bring out. One, obviously very well known, but your running mate for the first go-around was Senator Eagleton of Missouri. Have you ever talked to him since then?
Oh, yes, many times. Senator Eagleton and I have an amiable relationship. One of the great personal tragedies from my standpoint was the difficulty we had over the vice presidential selection in 1972, but I never had any doubt about the ability and decency of Tom Eagleton. He's a good man, and I'm happy that he's productive and doing great work in retirement.
And Richard Nixon. Did you talk to him prior to his death?
Oh, yes, yes. I went, gosh, it must be 11 years ago, way back in '84. I went to New York to his daughter Tricia's apartment one day to talk with him about a matter I was interested in, and that's the possibility at that time of a joint statement by former President Nixon and myself urging President Reagan to go to the summit with the Soviet leader and try to get some kind of a breakthrough on nuclear arms control. He did that a year later, not because we issued a joint statement, because President Nixon was reluctant to do that, lest it jeopardize his relations at the White House. But I've talked with him on numerous occasions after that, and I attended the funerals of both Mrs. Nixon and former President Nixon. That doesn't mean I agree with his policies or that I think that Watergate was not a deadly serious matter. It just means that we're human beings. We are Americans, and at some point you have to put grudges behind you.
Green Bay, Wisconsin, you're next.
Mr. McGovern. Mr. McGovern.
Yes.
I was wondering if you've had a chance to read Hunter Thompson's new book on politics.
Yes, I have. I try to read what he writes on most things.
I say this because you mentioned about what a great job that Clinton did. And there's an interesting anecdote about the '72 campaign, if I could quote here. Another thing I still remember from that horrible day in November '72 is some dingbat named Clinton was said to be almost single-handedly responsible for losing 222 counties in Texas, including Waco, where he was McGovern's regional coordinator, and was terminated without pay, with prejudice, and sent back home to Arkansas with his tail between his legs, as the maid put it. We'll never see that stupid bastard again, one McGovern aide muttered. Clinton, Bill Clinton, yeah. Let's remember that name. He'll never work again, not in Washington. Wonder if you could comment.
Well, Hunter Thompson's an old friend of mine, but I think you would agree, as one of his readers, that he sometimes exaggerates and distorts in order to make a point. Frank Mankiewicz said of his book, Fear and Loathing, on the '72 campaign, that it's the least accurate and most truthful book on the campaign. So I leave you with that as a hang-up.
One final point on this, and then we have to move on. How do you define a counterculture McGovernite? Or McGovernick?
Well, we have George McGovern right here. We should ask him.
Let me ask you first.
Well, Bill Clinton was a McGovern follower. I don't know why that was considered such a controversial statement, or indeed an insult. I mean, a lot of people, 40% of Americans were McGovernites, and Bill Clinton was a paid one for the '72 campaign. Counterculture means someone who is sympathetic to the counterculture of the late '60s and the early '70s. I never understood, I'm not sure, I never understood why this caused such a firestorm. It struck me as a reasonably straightforward statement. I think the counterculture is now in the past, so I don't know that it makes sense to say that Bill Clinton is now part of the counterculture. He's president of the United States. But I think he was and probably still is a McGovernite.
Well, I suppose I ought to be flattered to have both an adjective and a noun that are directed at my name. I think the term McGovernite even got into the dictionary for a while. I'm not sure it's still there. It was a rather dull definition that simply said a follower of George McGovern. But I look for followers wherever I can find them, no matter what their labels are.
Later today, education will be one of the issues talked about by the Education Secretary Riley, who is in the Washington, D.C. area talking about what he is calling the state of education in this country. Joining us is Madeline Kunin. Good morning.
Good morning.
As Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education, what will we learn today?
Well, we'll learn that America's school children are doing better and that the country as a whole is beginning to turn itself around. And that's good news from the days, when the Nation at Risk report came out 12 years ago, when everything seemed to be going downhill. And we've recovered from that. We've still got a lot to do, needless to say, but there's some very positive signs out there.
As a former governor in the state of Vermont, should there be an education department? Should it come from Washington or should it come from the states?
It has to come from everywhere. It doesn't come exclusively, it being educational improvement for our children, doesn't come exclusively from either the federal government or the states or the communities. And what we really see today is a strong partnership. And when we all hold hands and support our children, that's when we begin to see improvement.
Bill Kristol and George McGovern are both here. They want to jump in with a question.
Sure.
Well, I worked at the Education Department for 3 years, and I'm glad to see that perhaps some of my efforts, along with Bill Bennett, are now paying off. I do think the governors have been key, and I think Deputy Secretary Kunin would agree with this, in pushing serious education reform, and that involves taking on the education establishment. And I just think we need to push much harder in challenging the status quo and really trying to get parental involvement, and I would argue parental choice, into our school system to foster competition and excellence and high standards.
We certainly support parental involvement 100% and choice within the public school system. But we've launched a campaign to encourage parents to get involved with their schools, because that is the most effective thing to influence a child's ability to learn for a lifetime. So I don't think we're that far apart. Yes, the governors have been very innovative, but they also need some reference point to say, how are we doing? Are we meeting national standards, voluntary as they may be, global standards? Are we really preparing our children for the world that they are going to step into as adults? And that's where the federal government still plays a role in helping to share good ideas and being kind of a exchange center of information, of statistics, which has been the traditional role, and a booster. Education is so important to this country. If you lose that national voice, if it becomes de-emphasized, that's going just in the opposite direction where the American people want us to go.
First of all, let me just say I'm delighted that Madeline Kunin is where she is, high in the Department of Education. She was a great governor, has recently written a wonderful book, and I'm glad she's got a strong hand in shaping educational policy. I notice in the headlines of the Washington Post today the report on the crisis in the D.C. deficit. And it says, according to the story, that one of the things that's being considered is cutting education in the district so that students would go less than 180 days a year. I think that's too bad, and I hope we can find some way, perhaps with the cooperation of the federal government, in making sure that these youngsters in the district aren't shortchanged on education.
Well, I certainly agree that would be a very poor place to cut. If there's any possibility of avoiding that, that should be done, because D.C. kids already are not doing as well as children around the country, with some exceptions. There's some terrific schools in D.C., but there's a lot of catching up to do.
Let me follow up on Bill Kristol's comment, and then I'll get your reaction. Secretary Kunin, what role do you see the Education Department playing in states and local school districts? Right now you're talking about guidelines. Should it do more or less?
Well, one example of what we're doing is the new law Goals 2000, where we're providing what you might call a responsible block grant to the states. And this law was just passed last spring, and 44 states have already applied and received their funding, and they're very flexible. They're really helping states to build on the reform efforts that they've initiated and to sustain them. One of the problems with reform is that it's there for a little while when you have an inspiring principal or superintendent, and then it kind of peters out. And what we have to do is really make sure that this goes on so that we continue to see the kinds of statistics that Secretary Riley will report on today. Real improvement in reading, in math, in science, narrowing the gap between minorities and white students in terms of achievement, more students taking tough core courses. And that's so significant. If they take the math, if they take the science, they can succeed. And the federal government can beat that bully pulpit in order to make sure that that message is heard, that you not only have to stay in school, you have to take the demanding courses in order to succeed.
I think, Steve, the federal government does have a role to play as bully pulpit and as statistics collector and information exchanger. That's what the traditional Office of Education did until Carter, and a payoff to the teachers' unions, made it a cabinet department in '78. The traditional Office of Education did this for about $150 million. There are parts of the Department of Education, the Office of Educational Research and Improvement, that does that, and I think it should stay, and I think Mrs. Coonan should head it up if she wants, and be a useful little part of the federal government. We don't need a $30 billion education department. We don't need to tax the citizens to send money to Washington to have them send it back to the states for what Mrs. Coonan describes as very flexible block grants for education. If it's so flexible, let the money stay in the states for the first place and let Governor Allen of Virginia or Governor Dean of Vermont decide how much they want to tax and how they want to allocate it. The federal regulations, and my wife's very active in our local public schools, are a real problem for states and localities, and I think governors would say that, and most governors would say, just give us back the money, or even give us 2/3 or 3/4 of the money, get rid of the federal regulations. Goals 2000, which Mrs. Coonan describes as a very flexible block grant, is I think a 1,000-page piece of legislation full of prescriptions. Would be much better off without it, and I think without the Department of Education.
Your follow-up, Secretary?
There are no real prescriptions in Goals 2000, and I'm happy to announce that there are absolutely no regulations in Goals 2000. So yes, the law has words in it, which all laws do, but it has no mandates. And the states, you know, we're listening to our customers, which are the school children, the school officials, parents. They see us as a helpful partner. Now, we've got more work to do. We've got to get rid of more regulations. We've got to be even more flexible, and that is our plan. But people seem to want to have a national presence for the most important issue facing this country, and that is a well-educated citizenry.
Madeleine Coonan is the Deputy Secretary of Education joining us this morning. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Secretary Riley will be in Annandale, Virginia, outlining more details of the state of education, and C-SPAN will be covering that event. You can see it later this evening and in our weekend schedule. A couple of faxes. Bill Kristol, great Republican, from a viewer in somewhere, I can't figure out where, Charles McDonald. He must sell watches based on the stationery. He says, the marketplace will fix baseball. The real story is not being told. He's from Omaha, I can see in the bottom of the page. Also, a viewer in Ohio says, good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Kristol, he misspelled your name, though. Love listening to you. Keep up your good work. Please tell the president to keep his nose out of baseball. That's Clinton has his nose. That Clinton has his nose in everything except what is necessary. And another viewer says, I am very impressed with George McGovern, who would remember Ike's message. Now I know why he was defeated for the presidency. The, quote, power was against him, our loss. Lafayette, Indiana, you're our next call. Good morning.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve, for C-SPAN. I wish Brian were on so I could give him my personal welcome from his hometown.
We'll send it on his way. Thanks for calling in.
I've got a couple of points. It has to do with the coverage of the various medias in, as far as the Japanese earthquake was concerned. One way I look upon it is you've got Eastern philosophy and you've got Western philosophy. Western philosophy seems to place much greater significance on the physical and on the human body and such, whereas Eastern philosophy is more of the mind with less significance in the body. This goes back to Japanese belief during World War II when the kamikazes, they gave up their life because their body was not that important. So there's that shading on, could be a shading on the various coverages. The other thing I wanted to point out to McGovern, and it goes along with the same idea. Much of what the people are doing now is, again, focusing on the physical accomplishments, comforts, and all this. Mm-hmm. And basically, what it boils down to is, I go back to Job in the Bible. He, paraphrasing it, he said, the thing that I feared most has been visited upon me. And I think it's the mental and the spiritual breakdown of people in America that's really bringing the malaise that we're experiencing upon us.
Thanks very much from Lafayette, Indiana.
Well, I can only endorse that. I think that many of our problems are at bottom moral and spiritual questions. Those are areas that can't always be reached and probably shouldn't be reached by the federal government. There's no question, though, that when we talk about the decline of the family, the breakup of neighborhoods, the absence of personal responsibility, those questions go beyond mere politics to profoundly moral questions that the country has to face and that individuals have to face.
Before the election, Bill Kristol, on November the 8th, a viewer writes in from Atlanta. Bill Kristol stated that the contract with America was a serious mistake. He predicted disaster for Republicans as a result. Why should we take him seriously now?
It's not true. I endorsed and defended the contract with America and predicted Republican victories in both the Senate and the House.
Well, let me just say in that connection, I disagreed with much of that contract, but at least there was a contract. There was an agenda. And I think Democrats have to do more than simply knock Mr. Gingrich and his contract. They've got to spell out in clear terms what we stand for as a party, what our minority in the Congress is trying to accomplish. In short, we need a multi-point program of our own to give some substance to the criticism we direct at the Republicans.
Chugiak, Alaska. Is that correct?
Oh, whatever.
What part of the state is that located in?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was speaking to someone else. I just wanted to lend kudos to Mr. McGovern. He is an outstanding individual and a beacon and a light in a dark world. Okay, now that the kudos are gone, let's go to the meat of the matter, which is I can see the Republicans with their two-thirds majority in Congress carving up the middle class just like the Reaganites did in the early 80s. No one seems to see the parallels, and it seems most intriguing to me that they have the same proposals that Reagan had, that they were going to cut the budget, raise defense spending, and at the same time balance the budget. Now, let's take a simple mathematical equation. I make $100 a month, and I have to pay out $150 a month. This is what happened during the 80s. We paid out $150 a month. We only took in $100 a month. And what happened? We got ourselves in $4 trillion debt.
Well, if you want to use the analogy, we began the 80s taking in $100 a month. We ended the 80s taking in $130 a month. The trouble is our spending went up from 110 to about 150. I mean, tax revenues went up in the 80s. Reagan's increase in the defense budgets in the first half of the Reagan administration, I think, were defensible and I think helped win the Cold War. Defense has been going down in spending since '85. It's down 28% in real dollars. We're going to have to cut federal spending elsewhere or raise taxes, and that's a legitimate debate. I think the voters in '94 voted to take a shot at getting serious about curtailing the size and scope of the federal government. Maybe the Democrats will want to argue that we'll need tax increases, and that's a respectable position. I disagree with it, but I do think we need to get to a balanced budget, and I do think a decisive fight will be the fight over the next month or so for a balanced budget amendment in the Senate. I wish we did have a two-thirds majority, as the caller suggests. Unfortunately, we have 53-47 majority in the Senate. You need two-thirds to pass a balanced budget amendment. It's going to be an awfully important vote and a very close one, I think.
I think the gentleman is essentially right, though, that the Republican contract is a rerun of much of the Reagan assumptions of the 1980s, namely that you can cut taxes, increase defense spending, and end up with a balanced budget. That just doesn't work. And we certainly should have learned that in the 1980s. What you end up with is an enormous increase in the deficit and in the national debt. I want to come back to the defense issue for just a minute. Bill is right that there's been a reduction in defense outlays. It was coming down under Bush. It's continued to come down under Bill Clinton. But it still rests at around $285 billion a year. Now, to put that in perspective, if you add up all the defense spending of what we used to call the Sino-Soviet bloc, China and the 15 republics of what was once the Soviet Union, that combined spending on the military is now about 70 billion. In other words, we're outspending them 4-1. They accept the end of the Cold War. They accept the fact they're not going to go to war with the West. I think we ought to accept that and recognize that we can very substantially further reduce defense outlays, and this is what we ought to do. Not to be weak, but to be stronger.
But just, as a percentage of GNP, I think by '96, defense spending will be the lowest it's been in the U.S. since 1939.
I don't quarrel with that.
Yeah, and I'm worried that the conditions you described eloquently that you found at the beginning of World War II will recur again, which is we won't be prepared to deal with the kinds of crises that will emerge with nations like Iran, Iraq, North Africa. I mean, there's just a lot of trouble spots in the world, and I guess my view, and this I think would be the ultimate difference maybe, is that the U.S. does have to play a role in trying to preserve general world peace and stability, and that requires pretty substantial military capabilities.
I agree 100% on that, Bill, that we do have to play a peacekeeping role, a peacemaking role, and we need an adequate defense. Where you and I disagree is on what is required. I think if we had a defense budget, let us say, of 150 billion, which would be 300 times the size it was at the beginning of World War II, that with 150 billion, you still have far and away the strongest military budget in the world, and that's enough in my judgment.
A couple of final notes. We only have about a minute left. Will you endorse or work for a Republican candidate for the White House in 1996?
Well, what I want to do with my little organization is try to help the Republican Congress be a success. I think the key to Republican success in '96 is convincing the voters that they did make the right decision in '94 by sending Republicans majorities to the House and the Senate, and I think we'll succeed in passing a lot of the contract and lay the groundwork for a victory in '96.
Do you have a favorite, though?
No.
Leaning toward anyone?
No, I think we have lots of good candidates.
And George McGovern, a final note from you. You have been very public about the tragic loss of your daughter. Mm-hmm. For us as a country and for your family, what lessons do we take away from that death?
Well, my daughter died, as you know, from alcoholism. Marvelous young woman. It's just really sad. I still have difficulty talking about it, but we need to do more about alcohol in this country. Alcoholism kills about 100,000 Americans every year. We have to address that problem more vigorously than we have.
George McGovern, thank you very much for being with us. Bill Kristol, hope you'll both be back again. Thanks so much. If you have any questions or comments about C-SPAN's program or Washington Journal, please write to us, 400 North Capitol Street Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001. Or you can phone in at 202-626-7963, fax in at 202-624-0762, or if you are part of the internet, you can do so by linking up with C-SPAN guest at AOL.com. We're going to take a short break and have more of your phone calls, also a point-counterpoint on the issue of pornography as C-SPAN's Washington Journal continues.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal continues in just a moment. First, the C-SPAN school bus recently stopped in Arizona. There, we asked residents, if the election were held today, who would you vote for president?
I would vote for the current ticket. I'd vote for President Clinton because I don't think he's had a chance yet to accomplish the programs that he wants to accomplish, especially health care. And Gore, I think they both have a lot of vision for the United States.